Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining the Produce Safety webinar series. They're offered on a monthly basis, and it's on the third Tuesday of the month from 12 to 2 p.m., depending upon the topic and how long it goes. So for today's presentation, we have Dr. Erin DiCaprio with us. Erin is with UC Davis, and she is a cooperative extension specialist. And the topic of today's presentation is Food Safety Modernization Act, Produce Safety Rule Processing Exemptions. Next slide, please. Like I mentioned, Erin is an associate professor of cooperative extension in the Community Food Safety UC Davis Food Science and Technology Department. And make sure that any questions that you have related to her talk today, that you post those questions in the question and answer box so we can answer live or answer directly in the Q&A section. Next slide, please. The presentation is being recorded, and the key topics or the key information that's going to be covered in today's webinar includes an overview of the FSMA Produce Safety Alliance processing exemption information, exemptions and exclusions, particularly for determining a farm status, and then what makes you eligible for the processing exemption. Next slide, please. The resources from this webinar are going to be posted on our website, and there's a lot of different types of resources related to food safety, so feel free to browse our website and take a look at the different information that we have there. Both the recording and any other resources that are shared will be posted on the website. Right, next slide. There we go. There is our website. And so like I mentioned, all the resources will be posted on our UC Small Farms Food Safety website, and this will happen after the webinar is concluded. Right. Next slide. Muted. You're muted.
I need to unmute. Thank you, Aparna. Welcome, everyone. I'm Erin DiCaprio. As Aparna said, I'm Associate Professor of Cooperative Extension. I'm based in the Department of Food Science and Technology at UC Davis. My background is in microbial food safety. I work with growers, processors, and consumers to help navigate food safety questions they have. A lot of those kind of stem out of food safety regulations that exist. So today, what we're going to dig into is the Food Safety Modernization Act's produce safety rule and the processing exemption. So 2 months ago, we had a speaker from the Produce Safety Alliance, Don Stokel, talk about globally the exemptions and qualified exemptions to the FSMA Produce Safety Rule. But today we'll be digging into specifically the exemption that exists for produce that's destined for further processing and try and give you a little bit more detail as to the requirements there. As Aparna said, if you have questions as we go through the presentation today, please put those in the question and answer dialog box. And we have a lot of expertise within our team: Aparna Gazula, Thais Ramos, and Ahmed El Mokhazi, who are all collectively part of our UC Small Farm Food Safety team. So they'll be monitoring those questions as we go through, answering some as we go along, but we'll bring all those forward at the end of today's presentation as well. So I'm going to stay off camera just to help with bandwidth issues, but I'll come back on at the end of the talk when we get to the question section. So just a little primer for those that may have not joined our previous webinars or aren't as familiar with the Food Safety Modernization Act, or FSMA. This is really the largest overhaul we've seen in our food safety regulations in the US in quite some time. And overall, FSMA shifted the focus of food safety regulation to prevention of foodborne illness. And the timeline I'm showing here is just meant to give you a general overview of the evolution of food safety regulations in the US over time. You can see on this timeline that these regulations are focused on processed foods. However, with FSMA, we have the first federally mandated food safety regulation that applies to produce production, harvesting, and post-harvest handling. So under FSMA, we have the produce safety rule that applies to on-farm operations. More on that to come. But the produce safety rule really has stemmed out of outbreaks that have been observed related to fresh produce over the last 20 years or so. Prior to the Food Safety Modernization Act produce safety rule, good agricultural practices really set a framework for managing produce safety as well as many industry-driven standards and produce safety audit programs. So again, FSMA, or the Food Safety Modernization Act, this is an overarching regulation that covers the entire food supply chain. So here on this slide, we're showing 7 of the original foundational rules that were developed to implement FSMA. Now we have 2 additional foundational rules. Here we're going to talk primarily about the produce safety rule. So that's set forth in 21 CFR 112. And again, this is the portion of FSMA that applies to on-farm production of fruit, vegetables, and tree nuts. Also, we'll touch a little bit on the preventive controls for human food rules. So that is 21 CFR 117. And this is the portion of FSMA that applies to processed food production. The FSMA produce safety rule, again, this is the first federal food safety regulation that applies to the growing, harvesting, packing, and holding of vegetables, fruits, and tree nuts. The produce safety rule is based on the current scientific understanding of the point sources and transmission routes that lead to the contamination of specialty crops with foodborne pathogens. The focus of the produce safety rule is on minimizing the risk of contamination of produce, and it focuses on key areas with known contributions to previous documented produce outbreaks, as well as research on produce safety, and it includes standards for worker health, hygiene, and training, biological soil amendments of animal origin, domesticated and wild animals, and adjacent land use, agricultural, water, and equipment, buildings, and post-harvest handling. And the produce safety rule has specific requirements around these 5 areas aimed to mitigate food safety risks and will require documentation of your standard operating procedures, monitoring, and verification procedures that will show a farm's compliance with these regulatory standards. Additionally, the produce safety rule requires that at least one person in a farming operation attend the Produce Safety Alliance Grower Training course. This is the recognized standardized curriculum for the produce safety rule. And then an on-farm inspection to verify regulatory compliance will be conducted by the FDA or a state Department of Agriculture to verify regulatory compliance on the farm. Farms may be eligible for an exemption to the produce safety rule. Again, I mentioned we had a webinar 2 months ago on exemptions and also qualified exemptions to the produce safety rule. So I will refer you back to that for some additional details on these exemptions as well as the qualified exemptions. But the first way a farm can be exempt from the produce safety rule is if the produce that they're growing is what is referred to as rarely consumed raw. And so there is a list of specific commodities shown here that are exempt to the produce safety rule based on consumer data, which indicates these commodities are commonly cooked prior to eating. Also, produce that is not considered to be a raw agricultural commodity, shown here under the third bullet point, is not covered by the produce safety rule. Another exemption to the produce safety rule is that if produce grown on the farm is only for personal or on-farm consumption, then that produce, or that farm is not going to be covered by the produce safety rule. So finally, the last way a farm could be exempt from the coverage of the produce safety rule is if the produce that is grown on that farm is used in the manufacture of processed food products that go through a validated kill step. So here we're going to talk about what's required for a farm to be eligible for what we call the processing exemption to the produce safety rule. We will also discuss what are microorganisms of public health concern, how foods are processed to reduce risk associated with microorganisms of public health concern, and what type of information might be valuable to obtain from your buyer to verify that the produce is in fact processed to adequately reduce microorganisms of public health concern. First, I want to introduce what is required per the produce safety rule that would make a farm eligible for this processing exemption. So, of course, fundamentally, two types of documentation that are required to be eligible for this exemption. First, the farm must provide documentation to the buyer, which states explicitly that the produce is not processed to adequately reduce the presence of microorganisms of public health significance. So, this is something that you, as a farm, would need to have on any documentation that you are providing to a buyer that produce via a kill step. The second component within the produce safety rule to be eligible for the processing exemption, this is a requirement that the farm receives assurances from that buyer that the produce will be processed to reduce microorganisms of public health significance on an annual basis. So the farm provides documentation, and then the farm needs to get documentation from that buyer on an annual basis as well. However, caveat here, so due to challenges raised about the complexity of obtaining the buyer assurance statement, the FDA is exercising what's called enforcement discretion when it comes to the buyer written assurance requirement. This means that currently the requirement for obtaining that annual assurance from the buyer that produce is going to be going through a validated kill step is not being scrutinized. Okay, so this really does reduce the burden in meeting that processing exemption requirement for growers. So you don't need to get that buyer assurance on an annual basis currently. That is not being enforced. However, as a farm that's selling produce to a processing facility who wants to claim the processing exemption from the produce safety rule, the requirement for the grower to make that written disclosure that the produce was not processed to adequately reduce the presence of microorganisms of public health significance is being enforced. So as the flying that food processor, you still need to have this disclosure on your labeling and other documentation you're providing to that buyer. If you would like to read the official FDA guidance document outlining the enforcement discretion, it's referenced here. We'll also post this link after the webinar along with the recording of this presentation on our UC Small Farm Food Safety website for future reference. For California-based growers, so this is specific to folks in California, we have received information from the CDFA's Produce Safety Program. So this is the organization within CDFA that conducts the FSMA produce safety rule inspections in California on behalf of the FDA, that they will be asking for documentation to verify the processing exemption from you. So just for a little context here, the CDFA Produce Safety Program, they conduct initial farm verification calls to determine if a farm is covered by the produce safety rule. And if the farm's covered, they'll use that call to schedule an initial inspection. So during that verification call with the produce safety program, a farm indicates they're eligible for a processing exemption to the produce safety rule. The produce safety program inspector is going to be asking for documentation to be provided to them to verify the farm is indeed eligible for the exemption. Okay, so they're going to be asking for some form of documentation that shows, in fact, that produce is going to be processed through a validated kill step. I don't have any specific information on what type of documentation may be suitable for this verification for the processing exemption, but the CDFA Produce Safety Program has asked that any folks that have questions about this documentation reach out to them directly. So the contact information for the CDFA's Produce Safety Program is shown here. And we'll also make sure this information is available on our website as well after this webinar. If you'd like our team to help facilitate those discussions, we're happy to do so, and you can always reach out to us directly as well for that support. Okay, so from the farm side, if you have a processing exemption to the produce safety rule, any documents accompanying your produce must bear this statement. Produce not processed to adequately reduce the presence of microorganisms of public health significance. So some examples of documents that would need to have this disclosure include your labels, bill of lading, any shipment specific certificates analysis you're providing, and then any other documentation that you think may be reviewed by a food safety manager at that receiving facility. So basically, any documentation you're providing to that buyer, you want to make sure that you have this language included on those documents. Okay, so hopefully that's straightforward enough. So next I want to transition into a little bit from the processor side, what kind of information you might be wanting to obtain for them in the future should that buyer disclosure requirements start to be enforced. So we'll start with what are microorganisms of public health significance in the context of foods. So there are certain types of microorganisms that pose a health risk to humans if they're ingested, and these are the causative agents of foodborne illness. Multiple terms are used to describe a sickness that arises from consuming a contaminated food or beverage. They're listed here for reference. But broadly, there's no one syndrome that encompasses all foodborne illness is. However, there are typical symptoms, including nausea, vomiting, and diarrhea, but there are many other types of symptoms that can be associated with a foodborne illness. Bacteria are really the most important group of microorganisms when it comes to foods. They constitute a large domain of microorganisms. And depending on the type of bacteria, bacteria can be aerobic, needing oxygen in order to grow or multiply, or anaerobic. In these cases, oxygen is toxic to these microorganisms. There are some types of bacteria that cause food spoilage, so it's not a food safety issue, but they can lead to the rapid decline in shelf life of a product. Other types of bacteria are used beneficially in food fermentation, so we exploit microorganisms to actually produce or manufacture certain types of food products. But there are also certain types of bacteria that can cause foodborne illnesses, either via a foodborne infection or an intoxication in humans, should they occur in food products. And those are really the microorganisms we're concerned about when it comes to food safety. From the food processor side, we're also concerned about some types of bacteria that have the ability to form bacterial spores when conditions are unfavorable for that bacteria to grow or survive. These spores are very resistant to extreme conditions. That includes extreme temperatures, pH, very dry conditions. So these spores can exist in the environment and foods for long periods of time. And then when environmental conditions are again suitable for vegetative growth of these certain types of bacteria, those spores will germinate and we'll get increasing numbers of the bacteria in food products. Another two types of microorganisms that we're concerned about from the food safety side are viruses and parasites. There are certain types of viruses and parasites that can cause foodborne illnesses. Viruses and parasites don't actually grow in food. They're very host specific. They only increase in numbers in the specific host they infect, but many are very environmentally tolerant, so they can persist in the environment and cross-contaminate foods, leading to foodborne illnesses. I mentioned them here just for some context, so you know all the different type of microorganisms that we're trying to mitigate risks of occurring in food products. So I want to talk just for a minute about foodborne illnesses, specifically the difference between a foodborne microbial intoxication versus a foodborne infection. So foodborne intoxications are caused by the consumption of a toxin produced by bacterial growth in a food. In this case, the toxins are already present in the food, and it's ingestion of that preformed toxin in food, not the bacteria, that leads to illness. So, foodborne intoxications are typically going to be associated with processed foods. They're not something we're concerned with much in fresh produce, but it's really important to understand this because if you're selling your produce to a processor, they're going to be implementing controls to make sure there's not a risk of any of these particular types of bacteria that produce toxin in foods proliferating in a product and thereby causing a foodborne illness. So this is just an example here for context. We have canned potatoes that were improperly processed. So potatoes are a low acid food, meaning they have a pH above 4.6. And to can a low acid food, those canned products need to go through a retort or a pressure processing condition to get to temperatures to eliminate some of those bacterial spores I just talked about. One particular type of organism that is a spore forming bacteria that's of concern in these types of products, so low acid canned food, is Clostridium botulinum. So in this example, these potatoes, they did not go through that retort process. They were just processed in a pasteurization tunnel or a water bath canner. And because the temperatures were not high enough to destroy the spores of Clostridium botulinum when these canned potatoes were stored at room temperature, that provides ideal conditions for Clostridium botulinum to grow. And as this particular bacteria grows, it generates the botulinum toxin, which, if ingested by humans, causes the disease botulism. And so this example actually happened in Ohio in 2015. In this case, it was home canned potatoes. This individual canned these potatoes in a water bath canner rather than a pressure canner. And these canned potatoes were then used to prepare a potato salad for a potluck. And unfortunately, 29 people contracted botulism from eating that potato salad, and one individual did pass away. So this example, this is a home canned product, but this is also something that a commercial processor is aware of, and there are very strict parameters on how you process these particular types of foods because of the risk associated with Clostridium botulinum. So shown here are some of the bacteria that can cause foodborne intoxications. So one is Bacillus cereus, which produces a heat-stable toxin in food. It's typically associated with cooked food that has been improperly cooled. So Bacillus cereus is also a spore-forming bacteria, and the cooking temperatures we typically use are not able to destroy these spores. So if the food is held in what we call the danger zone, temperature range during cooling, these spores may germinate and you can get outgrowth of Bacillus cereus, and that will lead to its toxin being produced in that food product. Bacillus cereus also, its toxin that it produces is very heat stable, so reheating does not destroy this particular toxin. Staphylococcus aureus is a bacteria that's present naturally on human skin, and we can easily contaminate food with this pathogen. And if a product, again, is temperature abused, held within that or that danger zone range of temperatures, this bacteria can grow and produce toxin in foods as well. And then I already mentioned Clostridium botulinum. So this is a spore-forming anaerobic bacteria. So oxygen is toxic to Clostridium botulinum. So it's really a problem in canned food, while during that process, we're driving oxygen out of that container. Um, so it can be, and it is a risk in those low acid canned food products. So in all of these cases, when we're talking about microbial intoxications, these microorganisms grow in a food product. They create toxins as a byproduct of that growth, and it's us or animals consuming that toxin that leads to the illness. The incubation period is the time it takes from ingesting a contaminated food until you have symptoms of a disease. So when it comes to foodborne intoxications, this incubation period is typically short. Symptoms can show up hours after eating a contaminated food. So if you've ever had a foodborne illness where you ate something and almost immediately became sick, that was likely a foodborne intoxication event. Bacillus cereus toxin causes projectile vomiting and also diarrhea. So some of those common symptoms we associate with a foodborne illness. Clostridium botulinum, its toxin is a neurotoxin, so ingesting Clostridium botulinum toxin can cause blurred vision, double vision. It eventually leads to muscle paralysis and even death if it's not treated. So very, very serious outcomes associated with Clostridium botulinum intoxications. The other type of foodborne illness that can be caused by these microorganisms, it's what's called a foodborne infection. And this results from ingesting the microorganism itself. So in these cases, you have one of these microorganisms contaminating a food product. When you eat it, this microorganism will actually grow within your own body. And the result of that growth is the illness that you feel. So in this example here, and probably most folks are familiar with this, we have improperly cooked ground beef. In this case, E. coli 0157H7 survives in this product due to that improper cooking. If that undercooked hamburger is then ingested, this E. coli can grow in our intestinal tract, and this results in a foodborne illness. So we have to ingest the pathogen in this case in order to get sick. There are various types of pathogens that cause foodborne infections. These include bacteria such as Shiga producing E. coli, Salmonella species, Listeria monocytogenes, and Campylobacter, to name just a few. Viruses such as norovirus and hepatitis A virus also cause infections, as well as the parasites we're concerned about in terms of food safety, including Toxoplasma, Cyclospora, Cryptosporidium, and others. Again, in these cases, you have to ingest these pathogens, and it's the growth of these pathogens in your body that causes disease symptoms. Again, the incubation period is that time from when you eat contaminated food until you have symptoms of disease. For a microbial infection, it typically takes a bit of time for that microorganism to replicate or grow in your body to sufficient numbers to cause disease symptoms. A typical incubation period for a foodborne infection might be 1 to 2 days, but in some cases, this could be a much longer period from when you eat the food to when you actually experience symptoms. Most foodborne infections cause symptoms of nausea, vomiting, and diarrhea, and the symptoms typically last only a few days, but there are certain types of these pathogens that can have more serious and longer term health impacts. So again, we want to make sure that our foods are being manufactured in a way to minimize risks associated with these microorganisms that both cause infections as well as those that cause an intoxication event. Many of the microorganisms that cause foodborne infections are what we call enteric organisms, and these are microorganisms that are found in the digestive tract. Many of these organisms are also zoonotic, meaning they can infect both animals and humans. So many of these enteric microorganisms that cause foodborne illnesses in humans are common in animal products, as these animals may naturally harbor these organisms. So think about E. coli in beef and salmonella in poultry and egg products. Produce is susceptible with contamination with these enteric organisms as well when animals, both livestock and wildlife, contaminate the environment or they can contaminate products directly. There are also some types of foodborne pathogens that are considered to be environmental pathogens. And so these microorganisms can become established in food processing facilities and packing houses. And in this case, they may cross-contaminate foods in the post-harvest or processing environment. So in this very basic example, there's a conveyor line that's contaminated with a resident environmental pathogen. And as product contacts that contaminated surface, it becomes cross-contaminated with the pathogen. So that's in contrast to what we call transient contamination events, where let's say in this example, you have one apple that comes into a packing house that's contaminated with a pathogen. It might cross-contaminate one or two, three apples it comes in contact with, but that typically is going to be a low number of products coming through that facility that are going to leave that facility contaminated. In contrast, if you have a contaminated packing line, there's potential for every one of these apples to contact directly that contamination source. So you can have more widespread contamination of product coming out of that facility that has this resident contamination with an environmental pathogen. So these are all things that a food processor has to consider. It's something that if you have a packing house environment, you're going to be thinking about the potential for these environmental pathogens to become resident in that facility and cross-contaminate produce in that environment. So again, talking here specifically about processed food, there's a lot of potential ways where pathogenic microorganisms can be introduced into a food product, but when appropriate processes or measures are in place, these risks can be mitigated. So one of the potential sources for foodborne pathogen a processor has to consider are the raw ingredients, which in this case could include your produce if you're eligible for that processing exemption. This could be a source of pathogenic microorganisms from the food processor's perspective. So the processor has to consider all of these hazards coming in on raw ingredients and make sure they're developing their product formulation and their processes to make sure they are reducing food safety risks associated with any raw ingredients that they're using. So there's many different factors that can impact microbial growth in a food. The ones shown here are kind of inherent to the food product. So the nutrients or the food sources associated with that particular ingredient, the acidity level of that product, the time and temperature in which that product's going to be processed or held, the oxygen exposure. Again, oxygen can promote the growth of certain types of pathogens. It can inhibit the growth of others. So understanding that atmosphere is very important. And then moisture levels. So what is the water activity of that food product? So that is the amount of water that would be available within the food matrix for a microorganism to use for its own metabolism. So there's ways that a processor can manipulate those things to help in better ensure the safety of a product. So they can manipulate the pH of a food product. They can manipulate the water activity by drying a product or adding salt and sugar that's going to bind up free water in that product. They can also use various antimicrobials or preservatives to help inhibit growth in a product. They might process the product, and typically, this is what's referred to as the kill step, right? Apply a certain time temperature to actively kill microorganisms in that product. And then they may also manipulate the atmosphere within a package to help minimize microbial growth or how they store that product. So, what temperature they're storing that product can influence whether or not a microorganism can grow or not. So, basically, refrigerated, frozen storage are really going to slow down or stop the growth of many of these microorganisms. So, these are all things that a processor has to consider when they're thinking about how am I going to minimize risk associated with microorganisms of public health significance. So there's many different ways to manage food pathogens and processed foods. They can include directly killing or inactivating these pathogens in the food directly. It can include controlling the ability of these microorganisms to grow in the food product, as well as preventing cross-contamination with these pathogens during various stages of production. And in practice, it's really a combination of many of these different approaches that most processors are utilizing to reduce food safety risks. So I just want to take a minute here to define microbial inactivation and inhibition of microbial growth. Inactivation refers to a reduction of the number of these pathogens, these microorganisms in a food product. The process used for inactivation is normally called the microbial kill step, okay? So this is really what you're going to be looking at in this processing exemption. So is there a kill step that is applied to your produce? The specific level of inactivation required, or the level of kill, the log reduction as we call it in food microbiology, of the particular pathogen, it might be defined by regulations, which is the case specifically for Clostridium botulinum and low acid canned food products. There's some other regulations that define a specific log reduction that a processor has to achieve for certain pathogens. If there's not a regulation that defines what reduction is required, a processor may need to determine that level internally. So they would be relying on existing data on their product, their raw ingredients to determine what level of kill would be sufficient to help minimize food safety risks. Inhibition of microbial growth is another way to minimize food safety risks. In this case, the product's formulation or storage conditions are specifically designed to keep the hazardous microorganisms from growing in the food product. So examples here would include reducing a product's water activity, adding an acid to reduce the product's pH, adding preservatives, or storing a product frozen or refrigerated. So in practice, usually there's a combination of both an inactivation as well as an inhibition approach in managing food safety and processed foods. This table here shows some common process preventive controls or critical control points used to control these foodborne pathogens in food. So lethal treatments, so these are processes that are aimed to kill these microorganisms. Some common ones used in the industry are heat treatments. So any type of thermal processing, whether it's pasteurization, blanching, cooking, roasting, baking, as well as any kind of retort processing where you're getting to temperatures above the atmospheric boiling temperature of water. Those are all considered types of lethal treatments, those thermal processes. There are also some non-thermal types of lethal treatments. These are gaining popularity because they can help maintain some of the sensory characteristics of a food product that might be lost due to a heat treatment. So some of those include high pressure processing, irradiation, or different types of fumigation processes that can be applied to actually kill these microorganisms in a food product. Inhibition processes include, again, reducing storage temperatures, manipulating a product's formulation to lower its water activity, pH, adding preservatives, as well as dehydrating or drying. Many of these inhibition processes, if you use them in combination with a lethal treatment, you may be able to, reduce how severe those lethal treatments need to be because you're relying on a combination of these inhibition processes as well as that lethal treatment. So, a food processor is required to conduct a validation of their kill step. And so, here's the definition of validation as it's written in the Preventive Controls for Human Food Rule. Again, this is the FSMA foundational rule that applies to food processing. So, validation is gathering technical evidence, meaning data, that shows the controls established by this processor effectively control the identified hazard when they're implemented properly. Okay. So, it's basically the scientific evidence supporting that whatever lethal treatment or inhibition strategy this processor is using will control the identified pathogen for the particular product. Okay. We have another V word on the processing side, and this also applies, I think, to the produce safety rule, which is verification. So, verification and validation are different things. Verification are procedures that a processor has to put in place to ensure that their validated kill step is being properly implemented. So that would be things like monitoring time and temperature, pH. Those are going to be verification procedures that show that this processor is indeed implementing their validated process. So, validation, in other words, is the processor doing the right thing to control the pathogen. Verification is the processor doing what they said they would do. Are they following their validated process? So, validation again, this establishes the scientific basis for this process preventive control or critical control point that the processed food manufacturer has outlined in their food safety plan. So that scientific basis is usually based on a combination of scientific principles and data, expert opinions. So I'll talk about a process authority in just a minute. implant observations or experiments, and all of that data is used to formulate this validation for the particular control or kill step they're implementing. Much like the requirement for one person within a farming operation to attend the Produce Safety Alliance grower training course to meet the regulatory training requirements. There is a required training curriculum for food processors as well. It's called the Preventive Controls Qualified Individual Training. And that training is now about 3 to 3.5 days. And it's required that within a processing facility, that this validation process be conducted by an individual who has attended that course and has experience to be able to adequately validate a process. So for a food processor, they have to identify those pathogenic hazards that might be occurring in their food that need to be controlled for. They have to define what is my food safety outcome, and in this case, what level of reduction of that particular microorganism do I need to achieve in my product? And then they have to determine what type of process needs to be validated. So is it their heat treatment? Is it heat treatment in combination with a reduction in pH? So they first have to set out, what am I trying to control? What level of kill do I need? And then what steps in my process are aiming to achieve that level of reduction that we've determined is needed for our food. So to validate whatever control they've established needs to be validated, a processor needs to gather validation data and analyze the results. And in some cases, that might be simply implant data, looking at the temperature penetration in their particular product. In some cases, if it's a really new novel product, they might have to do some lab studies, pilot plant studies, and then implant studies. It all depends on the particular product and process. Finally, once they've analyzed that data, they need to have all of this validation, all of these studies that they've done, all that data they've generated documented. And that validation needs to be reviewed by a supervisor or a process authority, depending on the type of product they're manufacturing. Typically, not all cases, but typically, a validation process that is targeted to minimize microorganisms of public health significance will be developed and reviewed by what's called a process authority. So, a process authority is an expert or an organization that is authorized to evaluate and determine the correct thermal processing parameters and safety requirements for the production of food products. The process authority's role is to ensure that the food manufacturing process achieves the necessary parameters to destroy or control, again, these microorganisms of public health significance in a particular product. They really play critical roles, particularly in the manufacture of thermally processed foods, but they also evaluate products that are processed by other means as well. So a food manufacturer or processor typically works with a process authority when they're developing a new product or if they're adjusting an existing process in their facility. So these process authorities use a combination of scientific studies as well as modeling to determine the appropriate conditions for processing a particular product in a particular processing line. So it's very specific to the product as well as the equipment that's being used for manufacturing that product. With these evaluations, this process authority will issue what's called either a process authority letter or a thermal processing schedule to the food manufacturer. So this letter outlines the specific process parameters that must be adhered to during the manufacture of a particular product in a specific facility. Again, this is specific to the product the equipment that's used to manufacture that product, and the facility. So I wanted to introduce the concept of process authorities and the process authority letter, as this might be a suitable document for that buyer written assurance requirement under the FSMA produce safety rule, should that be enforced in the future for a farm to be eligible for the processing exemption, okay? So again, these process authority letters, they're specific to the product and the site of the manufacturing operation. And here's just a really basic example of what one of these letters might look like. I'm not a processing authority. I just made this up for educational purposes, but this example is for a canned salsa product. It's going to outline the product details, including ingredients, a description of the process, the container size that this product's going to be filled in, the pH value of the product, and the thermal processing temperature, as well as time. So all of these details shown here are critical for showing that the product goes through a validated kill step. So in this example, all of these things outlined, the pH value, the time temperature, the container size, the ingredients, all of those are really critical pieces of information for someone evaluating this product's kill step to say, yes, this is meeting the requirements of the validated kill step or not. So there's going to be a lot of detail in this process authority letter that would be very beneficial to obtain from a buyer to show that they are in fact using a validated kill step with the produce that you're supplying to them. Again, the buyer written assurance is not currently being enforced, but I think it's valuable to understand the details of what goes on in validating a kill step for potential reference. So a processor may not want to share with you exactly their process authority letter, but this may give you some good information on what details about that individual's process you would want to ask them for should you need, again, that buyer written assurance in the future to be eligible for the processing exemption to the produce safety rule. Just to summarize here, produce that receives commercial processing to adequately reduce the presence of microorganisms of public health significance. That farm is eligible for an exemption from the produce safety rule. So the farm is required to provide documentation to the buyer that the produce was not processed to adequately reduce the presence of microorganisms of public health significance. So you do have to do this as a farm. Again, providing on all of that documentation that you're giving to your buyer that that produce you supplied to them was not processed to adequately reduce presence of microorganisms of public health significance. So any documents accompanying that produce need to bear that statement. And then currently the requirement that the buyer provide written assurance to the grower that the produce will be processed to minimize risk associated with those microorganisms of public health significance. This is not currently being enforced, but should it be enforced in the future, going back to that process authority letter or asking for some of those details that would be outlined on that PAL could help meet this annual buyer assurance requirement. Again, for our California folks on the webinar today, if you are going through that initial farm verification call with CDFA's produce safety program, they will ask for some documentation to support your processing exemption. And again, you can reach out to any of us or CDFA directly if you have questions about what documentation may need to be provided. With that, happy to address any questions that folks have.